not really similar to any other game I've seen, except for maybe Planescape Torment. In that, like, there's a lot of sort of philosophical concepts built into the levels and things that you discover, and a lot more depth than a sort of typical dungeon crawl.
The other thing that I think is fun for the fan or for the artists is that they actually get to not only portray stuff that's in this this sort of concept, like the human-made stuff, but because the Numenera world has so many other weird things in it, like you get to portray weird stuff from other civilizations and ancient alien races and that sort of thing. So they can kind of go off into other worlds and civilizations as well, and portray things that you'll only see once or twice in the game.
I believe so. So you want us to do it? Well, I haven't received any keys or anything.
It looks like our host is having a conversation, so we will hang out and wait for him. If only I had access. Yeah. I could try to fill the space with random things.
You want to go to the next scene? The next slide?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so here we have the Reef of Fallen Worlds, which is the first place. Actually, let me get my cursor back. Which is oh god, that was my laptop cursor. Okay, so here we have the Reef of Fallen Worlds. Actually, this is just a small part of the Reef of Fallen Worlds. And this is, in fact, the broken dome that the player crashes into at the very beginning of the game. The player actually starts out the game falling. The very first experience you have is falling from somewhere in the upper atmosphere of the planet down toward the ground, and you do not have a parachute. So it looks very bleak for you. And in fact, as you can see in this screenshot, it turns out very bleak for you. But you don't end up dead, obviously. We won't reveal how or why. But you crash through into this.
It would be a very short game.
It would be a very short game, yes. And there is a choice you can make in that dialogue that makes it a very short game. But we won't tell you what that is. So anyway, you crash into the broken dome here, and come out, and then there's this reef area. It's called a reef. It's not a reef in the sense of coral that we think of in the real world. It's a reef of technology and buildings from previous worlds. Yeah. So each of these things is from some prior civilization, and in fact, there's more things off to the side over here, and there's some weird stuff happening here, and some crazy visual effects that we've had fun creating as well.
It looks like it's probably future civilizations sort of stapling on their own materials to combine these, because they don't match. They look like different people made these.
That's exactly,
That is exactly what Numenera is. It's basically a pastiche of many different civilizations and people using stuff from prior civilizations to do things that it wasn't necessarily meant to do originally. And in fact, sometimes the older civilizations would use things from previous civilizations. So it's just a big mess of technology and crazy stuff that people in the present day think is magic. And you can see here, people in the present day probably found some of these weird artifacts and things here and created ways of getting across from one structure to the other. And who knows what technology this was that they used. So yeah, this is a snapshot of the reef, and I think that's, unless you guys have anything you want to say about the reef.
No, let's go to the next slide.
All right, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and sort of just off screen is where you have one of your first combats in the game, and it takes place on the back of this giant insectoid construct that you can just sort of see the bottom of, and you can interact with some of the still lingering, like still powered artifacts and technologies to help the combat progress to fight off your enemies.
Well, speaking of combat, there was a question from Devoted Deity who asked about a possibility of a no-combat walkthrough, which apparently was possible in Planescape Torment.
Yes, and in fact, in Planescape Torment, it was possible, although I think in some cases it was you had to run by the enemies. So like there were enemies there, but you sort of had to run past them.
Okay.
We are trying very hard to make it so that you can actually avoid combat entirely, not just by running past enemies, but by being like the pacifist playthrough and getting past everything through your wits, through your dialogue skills, and through other things that you've learned along the way. So we're hoping that we're going to be able to pull that off. It's looking good so far.
Just using charm and diplomacy and stealth to get your way through the game.
Yep.
And possibly, solving puzzles to give yourself access to areas that let you circumvent where you might have to fight, that kind of thing. And even, I don't know if this is acceptable point to transition a little bit into what crises are, but we're calling our turn-based mode Crisis, just to sort of distinguish it from a more traditional combat where the whole point is just to kill your enemies. In a Crisis, the defining characteristic of a Crisis is that there's some time-sensitive thing going on. You are being attacked is the simplest one, so you have to carefully plan to not get hit.
Right.
But you also have other situations where you might have energy building up in a device and you're trying to do various things to shut it down, while maybe you're also being attacked. So there's many sort of layers of interaction and things you have to be dealing with simultaneously. And that's back when we initially made the decision to go with a turn-based mode instead of real-time with pause. That was one of the reasons we did that, is to make it so that we could do all those complex, interesting non-combat things and not have it just be totally overwhelming and too fast-paced, and it turned it into an action game, which is not what we want.
Right. So you're trying to balance feeling the pressure while still having time to think in a tactical and strategic way, which is the hallmark of RPGs.
Exactly.
A proper RPG as opposed to a ARPG or a hack and slash kind of thing.
And we definitely wanted to make sure that we offered all those interesting choices and strategies, but didn't get bogged down in reflexes.
Right.
Yeah. So let's check out the next shot, I guess.
Pull that up here. There we go.
All right, let me grab that mouse from you again so I can.
So we're back to concept art.
Yes. So we do not have screenshots yet for these, but we do have some concepts for everything. This is the district of Circus Minor. It is kind of our middle-class public square for the whole city. There's lots of merchants and weird attractions and things going on here. The player comes up from the reef, kind of over here, and then there's this whole area that's open to them. And one thing that I should point out is that once you get into the city, everything is completely non-linear. You can go wherever you want, whenever you want. There is a main story that brings you to various places in the city, but you can follow that in any order you want. You can walk around, you can explore, do as you please, which is very similar to the original game. Now I'll pick out a couple highlights of this. I can't spoil too much, but I'll talk about some of the odd things that you can find here. So as you can see, there is a little platform here. This is an execution ground. So one of the first things you see as you come up is this execution that's in progress. And this execution is a very Numenera, strange sort of execution that's happening here. The way they only the most serious criminals, but the way they deal with their criminals in Saga's Cliffs is they put them into this weird dreamlike, trance-like state, and they begin to babble all these weird visions and dreams that they're having. It's sort of these nightmares that are going on in their heads. And as they're speaking, their words are transformed into this ropey, tendrily stuff that's coming out of their mouth. It's a physical form. Kind of looks like rotted intestines. And they take this and they form it into a humanoid figure. And this humanoid figure, once it has been created completely, becomes your executioner. And what it does is, as this stuff begins to, and the reason they do that is, part of the reason they do that is to sort of keep the hands of the city officials clean. Right. This thing that's doing it. So this thing takes this stuff out of your mouth and begins wrapping it around your torso. And as it does so, this ropey intestinal stuff kind of begins to dry and harden up and tighten around you. And so over the course of hours and days, it tightens and tightens, and there's more and more of it, and you slowly get crushed to death, essentially by your own words that are coming out of your mouth and these weird nightmares that are coming out. So that is what is in progress.
That's really unpleasant.
It's very unpleasant, yes.
We've a number of times had conversations about George's mental health, but
yeah, this is my therapy, designing games. And in addition to that, there's a faction we'll get into a little later called the Dendra O'Her, who are corpse eaters in this city. And what they do is they can eat a dead body, and they glean from it the memories and the consciousness of that person. So like a small fragment of that person's consciousness like erupts into their mind and appears in their mind, and they will have some of that person's or many of that person's memories and thoughts. And so there is a creature or a person here called the Devourer of Wrongs, who is one of these Dendro Her. So when a person dies by this execution method, the person is eaten, and then in that way, the Devourer of Wrongs eats their body, and then they know all of their accomplices. They know all of their secrets. So there's no way to hide, like the people who are involved in the crime with them. There's no way to get away with it. So anyway, that is what is in the process of happening when the player emerges into Circus Minor. There is a person being executed. I won't talk about the details, but the player has the option of potentially stopping it and saving this person. But we have time-based events in this game. So if you don't save this guy in time, he will die, and then there will be a different state for the quest that's involved for his attempting to save him quest. Time-based events are based upon sleeps. There's not an independent clock going as there was in a lot of games. So when the player chooses to sleep, that's when the clock advances, right? And the state changes, and like a day advances, and then various things will happen in the city, and we'll see more things like that as we go. But this is just one example of that, the execution scene. I'll just point out one other thing, which is this clock up here. This crazy clock device that actually is unstuck in time right now, and the player. It's involved in the player's quest. It actually has to do with the changing god, who is the player's sire, who created the player, which is part of the player's main story. I won't get into exactly what the involvement is, but the player has to deal with something with this for the main story. Also, encamped around the clock is the cult of the changing god. Now you are a cast-off of the changing god in the game. You're essentially, he's this very powerful, people would think of him, I guess, as sort of a wizard or a nanotechnology wizard kind of guy, but he's a very powerful and knowledgeable human who has discovered how to create new bodies for himself and transfer his consciousness from one body to the next over many, many hundreds of years. You were one of the bodies that he created for himself, but then when he abandons it, a new consciousness emerges in that body, and you are one of those consciousnesses. So there's a cult here that worships him, and they're encamped around this clock because they know it has something to do with him, and you can actually join the cult and become one of them. That's one of the factions that you can be involved in the game. Crazy stuff.
All right, let's go right to the next slide, because we do want to make sure we finish this, and we're going to have to wrap up the Torment coverage soon. We still need to be able to talk to Josh a little bit.
All right.
I'm sure he's got some things to say, and
how do
so far away.
How do I jump to the next one?
I was just hit that. There we go.
Okay. So this is the district of Cliff's Edge. This is our kind of like rough, low-class neighborhood. And as you can see, there are some buildings here that have collapsed. The story in this scene is that there are these, I was talking about those creatures that are digging underneath the city crag, and it's causing damage all over the city, but particularly here, it's destabilizing the cliffs, and houses and things are collapsing into the ocean. So these structures that you can see that I'm kind of highlighting and going around to, as part of time-based events, eventually these will actually collapse into the sea if you wait around and you don't stop these creatures from digging. And then when you come back, this thing will be gone into the sea, and the NPCs that live here will either die or something else will happen to them. One of our points with time-based events is that it doesn't necessarily wreck content. It's not like if you miss the time-based event, then the content is ruined or it's not there for you anymore. It just changes the state, and there's some other interesting thing that happens.
What's the pressure that is causing you to sleep, as opposed to dealing with everything right away?
Maybe I'll let Jeremy hit that, since it's sort of related to crisis and skill usage.
Right. Well, so one of the core mechanics of Numenera is something called